This is one of the most majestic structures in all of Middle-earth, possibly in all of fantasy. An entire city carved straight into the mountain. 7 tiers of white stone reaching for the sky. It looks eternal and hopeful, a symbol of the greatness of men. But the more you look at it, you realize it's not really a city. It's a weapon. In fact, it's full of contradictions like this. It looks like triumph, but it's really built out of fear. It feels timeless, but it's actually the last breath of a dying civilization. But the strangest part is that it's not pure fantasy. It's inspired by real-world cities, and it reflects some tried and tested methods on castle-building strategies. So, in a lot of ways, Minas Tirith is the physical manifestation of human ambition and human anxiety. Another thing about Minas Tirith is that it looks impossible. So how could a city like this even be built? Originally, Minas Tirith wasn't a fortress at all. It was called Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun. It was built more as a royal seat and a watchtower guarding Gondor's capital, Osgiliath. Together with its twin tower, Minas Ithil, or the Tower of the Moon, they flanked the Anduin River and they created the perfect trinity. The heart of men in the center, with the guardians on the side. One facing east and one facing west. Opposites in geography, but they share the same architectural DNA, in that both towers were carved directly into the mountains. Kind of a signature of Númenórean engineering. But they really weren't these massive fortresses that you see today. It was when Minas Ithil fell to Sauron that it became Minas Morgul, and Minas Anor became Minas Tirith, the Tower of the Guard. And that's when the purpose completely shifted. And over time, the two towers evolved in very different directions. From a small watchtower into a fortress. So even though Tolkien doesn't really describe how it was built, this little bit of history can help us understand a lot. Most medieval castles were constructed from the ground up. You start by choosing a natural rise or a mound, the motte, then you crown it with a keep, then expand outwards with curtain walls and baileys at the base. But because it was originally a watchtower, it actually started at a high elevation. When Tolkien describes the city, he says it stands on the shoulder of Mindoluin, which in geological terms would be the spur of the mountain, which is right here. So what's now the Citadel and the White Tower would have been the original structure establishing the very first terrace. And because for the Númenóreans the mountain peak was considered sacred, they didn't build any higher. So the later generations expanded down the slope as the city expanded and urbanized, especially after Osgiliath lost its capital status and Minas Anor became the new capital. And then again later as Minas Anor became Minas Tirith in the War of the Rings. Each level successively grew downward, anchoring to the same ridge beneath the protection of the mountain. And this is when the very first true urban fabric started to form, with permanent markets and new tiers of housing, and this zigzag route that leads you up through the multiple gates. All of this probably formalized during this period. And the rock that they quarried from the mountain was reused to build the walls, which is actually why the architecture and the mountain blend together so seamlessly. This technique isn't just fantasy, it's a form of a living rock architecture, which we see in places like Petra or Lalibela, or monasteries on cliff edges. The Númenóreans, they just perfected it into a military art form. Then, when Minas Ithil fell to Sauron, Minas Tirith transformed again into a defense capital. Of course, that's when Minas Anor was renamed Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard. 6 of these tiers were strengthened, and each with its own wall and gate, until at last, the city became this vertical fortress of 7 concentric layers. It's kind of genius. The gates are not aligned, but they stagger as you go up. So if an enemy breaks through the first gate, they're forced to turn 90 degrees and march uphill across the wall, leaving them completely exposed to archers or catapults. In fact, in castle terminology, these are called the killing ground, or the killing zone. So by the time you reach the 5th or 6th level, you've lost almost half your army. By the way, all of this background research and custom assets that we made for our Lord of the Rings series, we decided to put it on a dedicated page so you guys can take a look. And we built the whole thing in Framer, who is also the sponsor of this video. Framer is a design tool that lets you iterate with precision and turn your design ideas into a live website within a single click. We explored different header variations that feel modern, but also it's aligned with this Middle-earth style. We also divided the page into 3 different sections, one for each race, and each with a defining element that anchors that race. All of the live previews and interactive alignment tools make it easy for you to see the results instantly. You can animate elements in full 3D without ever touching code. Everything just works through the simple transform controls inside Framer. And I love that Framer has a huge built-in font library, and finding something Middle-earth appropriate was surprisingly easy. Wireframer is another feature that I love. You can use AI to generate ready-to-fill layouts that you can populate just by dragging and dropping the elements. Here's the result, and now you can just click create web page and voila, it's live. It's also super easy to see how it can adapt across different devices, and our whole team can build in the same project together in real time. You can find our research page linked in the description, along with a Framer link and a discount code if you want to check it out. Krak des Chevaliers, one of the hardest fortresses to crack. Built in the 12th century in what is now Syria, it's one of those rare places that had this mythic reputation in its own time. It was called a fortress which could yield only to famine, and a mountain of strength that could not be taken by assault. Later, it was simply called the fortress. But from here, it looks pretty simple, just stone walls stacked on a hill. But from here, you can see that there's 2 rings of walls. So if the attackers breached the outer wall, they would find themselves in a trap designed deliberately for slaughter into the killing ground. The castle was attacked again and again, and it only fell once through deception and never by force. It's the same principle we see in Minas Tirith: geometry a strategy, and the terrain turned into a weapon. But actually, the movie version of Minas Tirith was modeled on a different city altogether, Mont Saint-Michel. It's built on a tidal island off the coast of Normandy, and here, the sea itself becomes the wall. Because when the tide comes in, the causeway completely disappears, and the island becomes unreachable. During the 100 Years' War, it survived pretty much every single English siege for almost 30 years. Not because of the military strength, but because it was unreachable. In fact, it wasn't even designed like a castle or a fortress at all, but more like a monastery. Because on the crown of Mont Saint-Michel, there's an abbey instead of a keep. So in a lot of ways, it's more similar to Minas Tirith, with the citadel and the white tower at the top, unlike, for example, Helm's Deep. So both cities are able to merge defense and meaning, where every ascent is both a prayer and a preparation for siege. But imagine actually living here. To get from here to here, you need to go all the way and weave in and out the ridge. And every delivery, every message, every loaf of bread, even with advanced pulleys and lifts, it will be exhausting. So great during a war, but during peace, it's kind of a logistical nightmare. It also creates a very distinct social hierarchy. The rich and powerful at the top, closer to the citadel and governance, and also closer to safety, and the poor live at the lower levels, and the most dangerous part. Because these killing grounds, you see, it's not just for the enemies. So you really start to see the contradiction here. It's majestic, but it's suffocating. It's impenetrable, but it's isolated. It's the perfect fortress, but it's also the worst city. And maybe it's because Minas Tirith isn't just for the living. Behind the White Tower is another city, the city for the dead. In the movie, Denethor takes Faramir across this long bridge to be burned at the houses of the dead, where all the kings and stewards of Gondor are entombed, as you can see here. But it's actually a little bit different from how Tolkien imagined it. According to Tolkien, the hall is more of a ceremonial function, and it's actually along the path where you find the tombs. He says there, The houses of the dead stood side by side, with their doors of stone, and there were tombs more splendid than the houses of the living. And the path is called Rathdinen, the Silent Street. But it's also not an isolated path like this. It's actually under the shadow of the mountain, and it was entirely enclosed by walls on one side and the mountain's flank on the other. So you walk through this narrow corridor wedged right up against the mountain where there's barely any light. It was a place of great silence, and you start to notice the air is cold and crisp. You feel the dampness in your skin, and you feel the weight of the mountain and the weight of your ancestors. And you can imagine, as you observe your own footsteps, one foot stepping in front of another, you're pulled into a kind of trance, a world between the living and the dead.
Stories, practically always, human stories, practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death.
And for the race of men, mortality is their curse, but it's also their engine, because it gives them urgency to build and conquer and to create legacy. But their desire to grow, it actually ends up suffocating them. And I wonder if this kind of grim worldview is something pulled from Tolkien's own personal experience from the war. Seeing his friends die in land that's been mechanized into a weapon, and then coming back home only to find that it's been replaced by factories. But this is Tolkien's sketch of Minas Tirith. Instead of the image that we all think of, this towering fortress carved into a hill, he draws a plan, and it looks more like a labyrinth. In the Middle Ages, labyrinths weren't made to trap people, they were actually meant to guide them. You'll often find them carved into cathedral floors, where pilgrims would walk this long and winding path as a form of meditation. It wasn't a maze with dead ends that's designed to confuse you, but it was this single, continuous route, and it was actually symbolic of the journey of faith. You take the long route, you turn again and again, and you nearly lose hope, and then finally you reach the center. And that's the paradox of men. They live knowing that they're gonna die, but they keep walking anyway. It's a painful, but it's a hopeful climb towards meaning.
There is no such thing as a natural death. Nothing that happens to man is ever natural, since his presence calls the whole world into question. All men must die, but for every man his death is an accident, and even if he knows it and consents to it, an unjustifiable violation.
So what do you guys think? And is there another structure from Middle-earth that you want us to make a video on? Let me know in the comments. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!